There's a moment every professional athlete dreads, and it's not what most people think it is. It's not the bad game or the losing streak or even the embarrassing playoff exit. It's the quiet creeping fear that today might be the day someone decides you're simply not good enough anymore. For Lexie Hull, that feeling wasn't occasional. It wasn't a rough week or a bad month. It was every single night for 2 straight years. And the worst part was that nobody outside the Indiana Fever locker room had any idea how deep the crisis actually went. That's what makes her story so fundamentally different from every other narrative spinning out of the WNBA's most turbulent, fascinating, and explosive era. While the entire world was watching Caitlin Clark rewrite record books and sell out arenas across the country, Lexie Hull was quietly going through one of the most remarkable personal transformations in women's basketball history. She went from a player on the verge of losing everything to one of the most genuinely compelling figures in the entire league. And when she finally decided to speak openly about what that journey actually looked like from the inside, what she said stopped people cold. Before any of this made sense, you needed to understand exactly where Lexie Hull started, because the contrast is where the real story lives. The 2022 WNBA draft looked perfect on paper in every conceivable way. 6th overall pick, Stanford graduate, national champion, 3 All-Pac-12 selections, the Elite 90 award for combining athletic excellence with academic achievement at the highest level. On every single measurable metric, Lexie Hull was exactly the kind of player franchises build entire futures around. She was the kind of prospect who arrives with credentials so polished they practically shine. She had accomplished everything a college basketball player could accomplish. But the draft night cameras didn't show what she was actually walking into, and that's where the real story begins. The Indiana Fever in 2022 weren't just a bad basketball team. They were, by most accounts, one of the worst franchises in the entire league. Losing seasons year after year, no playoff appearances in sight, and a culture that had been struggling to find its footing for years. The organization had been treading water, unable to find any momentum or direction. This wasn't a team on the rise. This was a franchise in crisis. For a young player trying to establish herself in a professional league, there is perhaps no harder environment to grow in than one where the team around you is also fighting to survive. Every game becomes an audition. Every missed shot gets interpreted as evidence. Every substitution carries the weight of what it might mean for your entire future. When your teammates are struggling and the wins aren't coming, there's nowhere to hide. You can't blame the system because the system is broken. You can't blame the supporting cast because they're trying just as hard as you are. You're left with only yourself to scrutinize, and that's a dangerous place for a young player's psyche. Hull averaged fewer than 5 points per game across her first 2 seasons. Read that again for a second, because the contrast matters. A top 10 draft pick, a Stanford-educated basketball player with a national title already on her resume, was averaging fewer than 5 points per game. In her second season, she was logging more than 20 minutes a night, which means the coaching staff believed in her enough to give her significant playing time, and she still couldn't push past 4 to 6 points consistently. The numbers were not just disappointing. They were the kind of numbers that end careers before they really begin. They were the kind of numbers that make franchises regret their draft night decisions. They were the kind of numbers that make young players question everything they believed about themselves. But here's what the box scores didn't capture, and this is crucial to understanding her story. The numbers only told half the story, and the half they told was actually the less important one. The part nobody outside that building could see was what was happening inside Lexie Hull's head. Athletes rarely talk about fear in honest terms because there's a culture of toughness in professional sports that actively discourages that kind of vulnerability. It's especially true for players still trying to prove they belong, players still fighting for their roster spot, players who feel like they're one bad stretch away from being cut. So when Hull opened up in an interview with Glamour magazine about what those early years actually felt like, it landed differently than most athlete confessionals do. She described moments where the fear of missing a shot wasn't just about basketball. It wasn't about pride or performance metrics or competitive drive. It was about survival. She was genuinely concerned, not anxious in some abstract sense, but genuinely concerned. That one bad decision on the floor, one missed opportunity, one wrong read in a crucial moment could be the thing that got her cut from the roster entirely. A Stanford graduate with a top 10 draft pedigree was lying awake at night worried that a single missed jumper might end her entire career before it started. That wasn't anxiety in the theoretical sense. That was the real, daily psychological weight of playing on a losing team with no margin for error and no safety net beneath her. She described those early years as nerve-wracking in a way that went beyond the court, and she was right. Losing cultures do something specific to a player's psyche that winning cultures never do. When there's no winning to smooth over the rough patches, when there's no playoff run to give the season meaning, when every individual mistake gets magnified by the absence of team success, the stakes feel impossibly high even when the situation objectively isn't. And for someone already questioning whether she truly belonged at this level, that environment was quietly destructive in ways that nobody watching from the outside could fully appreciate. What made her admission remarkable wasn't just the honesty, it was the clarity. She understood precisely what had been happening to her. She could name it. She could explain how the pressure had gotten into her mechanics, her breathing, her movement patterns, and her decision-making in real time during live games. She could articulate exactly why a player with her skill set was underperforming so dramatically. That kind of self-awareness doesn't come easy. And it matters, because it's exactly what allowed her to respond the way she did when everything around her suddenly and completely changed. The fear that gripped Lexie Hull during those first 2 seasons in Indianapolis wasn't something she could simply switch off after games ended. It followed her home. It invaded her sleep. It shaped the way she practiced, the way she prepared, the way she approached every single minute of basketball she played. This wasn't a performance issue that could be fixed with better shooting form or more film study. This was something deeper, something that had infiltrated the foundation of her professional identity. Understanding the psychology of losing is crucial to understanding what Hull went through. Professional sports operate differently than college athletics, even though many players make the transition believing the fundamentals will remain the same. In college, you're playing alongside people you've grown up with, people who share the same 4-year timeline, people who understand that losing together is still part of a broader educational and developmental experience. The stakes feel high, but there's also a built-in safety net. You're building something together with your teammates. In professional sports, especially on a losing team, it's different. You're fighting for your job every single night. The players around you aren't your teammates in the emotional sense. They're your competition. The coaching staff isn't invested in your long-term development. They're invested in winning now, in proving they made the right moves, in keeping their jobs. And if you're not contributing to winning, you become a liability. You become someone the team might choose to move on from. For Hull, this reality created a psychological loop that fed on itself. The pressure of the losing environment caused her to play tentatively. Playing tentatively caused her to underperform. Underperforming reinforced the fear that she didn't belong. And the fear that she didn't belong made her play even more tentatively. It was a vicious cycle, and she was trapped inside it every single game. What's remarkable is that Hull eventually developed enough self-awareness to recognize this cycle while she was living it. She could articulate exactly how the fear was manifesting in her body. She understood that her breathing was becoming shallow when she touched the ball. She noticed her shot selection changing, becoming more conservative, less aggressive, more focused on avoiding mistakes than on executing properly. She saw how her decision-making slowed down in crucial moments, how she was processing information more slowly because her mind was divided between playing and worrying about the consequences of playing poorly. This is important because it shows that Hull's struggle wasn't a talent problem. It wasn't a skill problem. It was a psychological problem that a talented, skilled player had no tools to solve. She couldn't take a masterclass to fix her confidence. She couldn't watch film to understand how to manage fear. She couldn't practice her way out of the emotional weight that was pressing down on her every night. The losing culture of the Fever during those years created a specific kind of pressure that doesn't exist on successful teams. On winning teams, there's margin for error. A player can have a bad game because the team might still win. A player can make a mistake and move on because the team will cover for it. But on a losing team, Every individual performance gets scrutinized more intensely. Every mistake becomes evidence, not just of a single bad play, but of a fundamental inadequacy. Hull was experiencing this amplified scrutiny from herself most of all. She was her harshest critic. She was reviewing every miss, every poor decision, every moment she felt she could have done better. And because the team was losing, there was no context in which to view these moments charitably. There was no, well, we won anyway, so it doesn't matter as much. Every poor performance stung because it felt like it mattered more, like it was contributing directly to the team's failure. What's particularly striking about Hull's willingness to talk about this later is that it represents a kind of strength that doesn't show up in any box score. It takes genuine courage to admit that you were scared, that you were struggling mentally, that the circumstances around you were affecting your performance in fundamental ways. Most athletes would rather pretend they were simply working hard and improving gradually. Most athletes would rather construct a narrative of steady growth and positive development. Hull chose, instead, to be honest about the darkness of that period. She chose to name the fear. She chose to explain how it affected her mechanics, her breathing, her presence of mind during competition. That honesty is what makes her story resonate, because it acknowledges something that most people don't want to admit. Sometimes, circumstances genuinely do matter. Sometimes, environment genuinely does shape outcomes. And sometimes, no amount of personal will or work ethic can overcome the psychological weight of playing in a losing culture. In April 2024, the Indiana Fever selected Caitlin Clark with the first overall pick in the WNBA draft, and that single moment changed everything about Lexie Hull's professional reality. If you need a quick refresher on what that moment represented, it was absolutely seismic. Clark was the most prolific scorer in the entire history of NCAA basketball, men's or women's. She didn't just break records, she shattered them. She had spent 4 years at Iowa, turning Big Ten women's basketball into a legitimate national television event. Before Clark arrived at Iowa, the Big Ten Women's Conference was something that casual sports fans simply didn't pay attention to. It existed, sure, but it wasn't must-watch television. The games weren't getting primetime slots. The arenas weren't selling out. But Clark changed all of that almost immediately. She had an impact on college basketball that was almost unprecedented for a female athlete. She shattered records that had stood for decades. She had sold out arenas in cities that had never shown up for women's college basketball before. She had made the Iowa Hawkeyes one of the most watched college sports programs in the country. The question hanging over her arrival in the WNBA was simple but absolutely enormous. Was any of this real, or was it all a college bubble that would pop the moment she stepped onto a professional floor? This is the question that always hangs over transformative college athletes. No matter how dominant you are in college, there's always skepticism about whether you can replicate that success at the professional level. The level of competition is fundamentally different. The athleticism is higher. The defensive schemes are more sophisticated. The margin for error is smaller. Great college players have disappeared into mediocrity when forced to compete professionally. It happens all the time. So when Clark was drafted first overall by Indiana, there was genuine uncertainty about whether she would be able to maintain her dominance at the professional level. The answer came fast, and it was unmistakable. Clark broke WNBA records for fan engagement, television viewership, and rookie performance in ways that made the previous benchmarks look almost quaint by comparison. She didn't just perform well. She performed at a level that suggested she might be the most impactful rookie in the history of women's professional basketball. The Indiana Fever went from one of the league's forgotten franchises to the most discussed, most controversial, most covered team in women's sports almost overnight. Sellout crowds, national broadcasts, a media presence that followed the team everywhere they went. The Fever had become must-watch television, and the entire league felt the shift immediately. Suddenly, women's basketball was a legitimate draw. Suddenly, networks were competing for broadcasting rights. Suddenly, sponsors were interested. Suddenly, arenas were selling out. The impact extended far beyond just the Fever. The entire WNBA was experiencing a surge in interest that had been building for years, but exploded with Clark's arrival. But what happened inside the lines was what actually mattered most to the players who were already there. What happened inside the lines was what would change Lexie Hull's entire trajectory. And for Hull, what Clark brought to the court was something that most casual observers completely missed. It wasn't just her scoring ability, although that's obviously important. It was something more subtle and more impactful in terms of how it affected her teammates. There's a specific kind of player who changes the game for everyone around them without necessarily dominating the box score themselves. Clark is obviously an elite scorer, but her most underrated quality, at least according to the people who share the court with her every single night, is something far less easily measured. It's her vision. It's her ability to read a defense several steps ahead of where the play is actually happening. Her instinct for drawing defensive attention and creating openings for teammates that materialize almost faster than the defense can respond to them. This is what separates truly great playmakers from good playmakers. Good playmakers see what's happening right now. Great playmakers see what's about to happen. They understand how defenses will react before the reaction happens. They know which teammate will be open before that teammate even recognizes the opportunity exists. Clark operates at that elite level of playmaking, and for a player like Lexie Hull, this was transformative. For Hull, what Clark brought to the court translated into something she hadn't experienced in 2 full professional seasons: open looks. Real, genuine, uncontested opportunities from the perimeter that weren't the product of a broken play or a lucky defensive rotation. She was getting the kind of shots she had been taking in practice for years, the ones she knew how to make, but had been too mentally locked up to execute consistently in games. Suddenly, the open looks were coming intentionally, not accidentally. Suddenly, the system was designed to get her the ball in rhythm. And the results were immediate and dramatic. Hull's three-point shooting percentage in 2024 was 47.1%. That wasn't just a career best. That was one of the finest individual shooting performances in the entire WNBA that season. For context, her three-point percentage at Stanford had sat around 36 to 37%. She had returned to that number and then blown past it entirely the moment she stopped playing with the psychological weight of a losing culture pressing down on every single shot she took. She described the shift herself in terms that were almost disarmingly simple. She knew the open shots were coming. She knew the work she had put in was real. So instead of gripping every attempt like it might be her last chance, she let herself live with the outcome. She allowed herself to take the shot and accept whatever happened next. That's the kind of mental freedom that no shooting coach can give you and no film session can manufacture. It comes from trust in your teammates, in the system, and eventually in yourself. Clark had given her the first 2. Hull had found the third on her own. But understanding how Clark changed the game for Hull requires understanding the specific mechanics of how great playmakers operate. It requires understanding the difference between playing on a team that desperately needs you to take shots and playing on a team that creates opportunities for you to take the right shots. Before Clark arrived, Hull was in a position where she was expected to create her own offense. She was one of the few reliable shooting threats the Fever had, which meant every time she touched the ball, there was an expectation that she would do something with it. The defense knew this. The defense played accordingly. They worked hard to make sure she didn't get open looks, and when she did manage to create space, she was often doing so against determined, focused defensive attention. It's one thing to make a shot when you're open. It's a completely different thing to make a shot when someone is working hard to close you out. Clark changed the equation entirely. By commanding so much defensive attention that multiple defenders would collapse on her when she drove or received the ball, she created space for everyone around her. But it wasn't just about getting shooters open. It was about getting shooters open in rhythm, getting them the ball in spots where they could shoot without thinking about mechanics or technique. It was about creating situations where Hull could react rather than deliberate, could flow rather than force. This distinction is crucial because it speaks to why Hull's shooting percentage increased so dramatically. She wasn't suddenly a better shooter in 2024 than she was in 2023. She wasn't suddenly smarter about shot selection. She wasn't suddenly more confident. Well, she was more confident, but that confidence came from the fact that she was getting better looks, not the other way around. The confidence followed the good looks, not the reverse. What Clark understood, almost instinctively, was how to use her own dominance as a tool for elevating her teammates. She could have been a selfish scorer, constantly hunting shots, constantly trying to score 30 points a night. That's what elite college scorers often do. They get used to being the best player on the floor, and they lean into that identity. But Clark's approach was different. She saw her scoring ability as something that could be used to create opportunities for others. Hull described the shift herself in terms that were almost disarmingly simple. She knew the open shots were coming. She didn't have to wonder whether she'd get a fair chance. She didn't have to worry that she was wasting a possession by taking a shot instead of moving the ball. She knew that Clark understood the value of getting her good looks. She knew that the system was designed with her skill set in mind. And most importantly, she knew the work she had put in was real. All those years of shooting and practice, all those hours of skill development, all that preparation was finally going to be used the way it was intended. So instead of gripping every attempt like it might be her last chance, like she was trying to prove something with every single shot, she let herself live with the outcome. She allowed herself to take the shot and accept whatever happened next. That sounds simple, but it's actually the most complex mental adjustment any athlete can make. Because to let go of the result, you have to trust that you've done the work. You have to believe in your preparation. You have to accept that some shots will go in and some won't, and that's okay. You have to let go of the fear that one miss might define your career. That's the kind of mental freedom that no shooting coach can give you and no film session can manufacture. It's something that has to come from the environment around you. It has to come from teammates who trust you. It has to come from a system that validates your abilities. It has to come from an organization that believes in you. Clark gave her all of that, and in return, Hull gave her 47% three-point shooting. For context, her three-point percentage at Stanford had sat around 36 to 37%. She had returned to that number, and then blown past it entirely the moment she stopped playing with the psychological weight of a losing culture pressing down on every single shot she took. That 47% represents more than just improved shooting. It represents the liberation of a player from the psychological constraints that had been holding her back. It represents what Hull was capable of all along, given the right circumstances. This is what elevates Clark's contribution beyond just her individual scoring. Yes, she dropped 20 points a night. Yes, she was one of the most efficient scorers in the league. But her impact on Hull's game, on the entire team's offense, was something that doesn't show up in her assist numbers. It doesn't fully capture the way she changed the environment for everyone around her. But the court was only one dimension of what was changing for Lexie Hull. Off the court, something equally unexpected was developing. When Clark was drafted, there were genuine concerns in basketball circles about how she would fit into a locker room full of players who had already spent years together building relationships and a team identity. These weren't unfounded concerns. This happens in professional sports all the time. A franchise develops a culture, and then a major change disrupts that culture. She was arriving as the most famous player in the sport, the face of a franchise transformation, and the subject of more media attention than any WNBA player in recent memory. Imagine being a player on the Fever roster, and suddenly your team becomes the most talked about, most scrutinized, most followed team in women's basketball. Your locker room becomes the center of national attention. Your everyday interactions become the subject of analysis. Your body language becomes data that media members and fans dissect. Clark had spent 4 years at Iowa surrounded by teammates she had grown up playing with, players like Gabby Marshall and Kate Martin, people who knew her before any of this, before the records, before the national spotlight, before the impossible pressure of expectation. They had a foundation together. They had history. They had trust that had been built over years of playing together, of sharing experiences, of being on the journey together from the beginning. Indiana was different. These were professionals with their own careers, their own journeys, their own complicated feelings about what this moment meant for the league and for them personally. Some of them had spent years trying to build a winning culture in Indiana, only to see the trajectory of the franchise completely altered by a single draft pick. That's not necessarily negative, but it's certainly disorienting. It's a reminder that your efforts, your development, Your years of work can be overshadowed by a single transformative acquisition. The worry in some circles was real. Would the established players welcome her, or would they resent the spotlight shift? Would the disparity in attention create friction? Would the locker room hold together under that kind of weight? These are legitimate concerns that have derailed teams before. Egos can clash. Attention can breed resentment. Expectations can create division. What actually happened was the opposite of what anyone expected, and it started with Lexie Hull. The two clicked almost immediately, and not in a polished, PR-managed way that gets carefully crafted for media consumption. In the genuine, slightly chaotic way that real friendships actually form. They were spending time together off the court in Indianapolis, experimenting with cocktails, filming content together for TikTok, genuinely enjoying each other's company. They were doing the kinds of things that real friends do, not the kinds of things that professional teammates are supposed to do for the cameras. During the WNBA's Olympic break, when the league sent players on a trip to Mexico, the two of them were inseparable in a way that registered clearly to anyone watching. This was not a manufactured connection for the cameras. It was the real thing, and everyone could tell because there was a comfort between them that can't be faked. They were laughing together. They were supporting each other. They were genuinely enjoying being around each other. By the time the 2025 season approached, the dynamic had grown into something that had its own name and its own identity in WNBA culture. Sophie Cunningham had been traded to Indiana in the offseason, and the three of them, Clark, Hull, and Cunningham, began calling themselves the Treslocks. The trio became one of the most entertaining and genuinely likable presences in the entire league. They weren't trying to be likable. They were just being themselves, and people responded to that authenticity. They caddied together at an LPGA Pro-Am, bringing women's basketball players into a golf context in a way that was genuinely fun and genuinely funny. They roasted each other constantly on social media in ways that made it clear they were completely comfortable with each other. Hull told People magazine that Clark could use some sun exposure, turning a set of Fever Media Day photos into one of the funnier off-season moments the league had seen in years. Hull even posted on Instagram with the caption, "We are so back," needling Clark's famously pale complexion in a way that only works when both people are completely at ease with each other. You can't make fun of someone's appearance unless there's trust and affection underneath the joke. The fact that Hull felt comfortable doing this publicly, and the fact that Clark responded well to it, shows that they had moved past the initial getting to know you phase and into genuine friendship. It was the kind of friendship that gave fans something genuinely rare in professional sports, a real look at who these players actually are when the cameras aren't being carefully managed. And then Hull confirmed what many had already suspected. She told interviewers that Clark would be at her wedding. That wasn't a casual, offhand comment. That was a significant revelation about the depth of their connection. Hull had gotten engaged in April 2025 to Will Matson, a former Stanford baseball player who had been selected in the 6th round of the MLB draft before a series of injuries forced him to retire from the sport. The two had met at Stanford, and after Hull was drafted and relocated to Indianapolis, Matson gave up his baseball career entirely and moved there to be with her. He rebuilt his entire life around hers, and he was now standing at the center of one of the biggest personal moments of her life. And Caitlin Clark was going to be there for it. That's not a PR story. That's a real one. But even as all of this was unfolding, Hull was quietly preparing to say something that would cut through every cheerful headline and carefully angled Instagram post. She was getting ready to be honest in a way that most players in her position would have chosen to avoid entirely. The 2025 WNBA season arrived with absolutely enormous expectations. Clark had finished her rookie year as the most impactful first-year player the league had ever seen. And heading into year 2, there was a sense that she was ready to take her game to the next level. Hull had described the difference in Clark as undeniable. There was a seriousness to her presence that hadn't been there before, a sharpness and a focus that told everyone around her she was done adjusting and ready to take over. Hull told reporters before the season started that it was obvious Clark had arrived ready to do business, ready to dominate, ready to take the next step in her development. This wasn't rookie year Clark anymore. This was a player who understood professional basketball and was ready to take control of the narrative. Through the first 7 games of 2025, Hull was the best player on the team by any reasonable measure. She was leading the entire WNBA in three-point shooting percentage at over 55%. She was averaging more than 10 points per game. The Fever looked like a team that had taken the next step, a genuinely cohesive unit with real championship potential. Everyone could see it. The pieces were in place. The system was working. The team chemistry was undeniable. This was a different Fever than the year before. And then the injuries started. Clark's quad went first, then her groin, then a soft tissue issue that knocked her out for another stretch. By July 15th, she was dealing with a 4th separate physical setback in just a few months, this one coming during a game against the Connecticut Sun. The image from that night was one of the most striking of the entire season. Clark, after giving everything she had, walked off the floor and sat on the bench with a towel covering her face. Her forehead was resting against the basket structure. She looked like someone trying to hold herself together through sheer willpower. The image captured something essential about what Clark was going through. This wasn't just physical pain. This was emotional exhaustion. This was the frustration of a player who knew what she was capable of but whose body was refusing to cooperate. And sitting right next to her, not saying anything, just being there in the moment, was Lexie Hull. Not trying to fix it, not trying to say something profound, just being present, just showing up for her friend. Hull spoke about that period afterward with an honesty that was clearly deliberate. She described Clark going through the kind of frustration that only comes when your body refuses to cooperate with what your mind and your work ethic are demanding of it. The physical decline wasn't from a lack of effort. It was despite an almost superhuman amount of it. That distinction mattered, and Hull understood it completely. This wasn't laziness. This wasn't a mental block. This was a body that was breaking down. The Fever, despite losing Clark for significant stretches, fought their way to the WNBA semifinals. They weren't supposed to make it that far without their best player healthy for the entire season. But they did. They grinded it out. They made it work. They took the eventual champion, Las Vegas Aces, to a Game 5 that went to overtime before Indiana's run finally ended. Hull's contribution to that run wasn't the kind that fills highlight packages on SportsCenter. She wasn't the leading scorer. She wasn't dropping 30 points per game. She was defending the best perimeter scorer on opposing teams every single night. She was making the kind of two-way plays that keep games close when everything else is falling apart. She was being the player her team needed rather than the player the cameras were most interested in. And she was doing it while carrying the emotional weight of watching her closest friend on the team go through one of the hardest professional stretches of her career. That's not something you see in the stat sheet. That's not something that shows up in any box score. But it matters because it speaks to who Hull is as a person and as a teammate. She was there, she was present, she was supporting her friend through difficulty, and she was also playing her role at an elite level. All of that was building toward a moment Hull had clearly been thinking about for a while. In October 2025, Glamour magazine ran a Women of the Year feature that included Hull alongside some of the most high-profile names in entertainment and sports. It was a significant recognition for a player who had quietly become one of the most respected presences in the league over the past 2 seasons. This wasn't a mainstream celebrity award. This was specifically recognizing women who had made an impact in their respective fields. Most people expected the interview to be the kind of warm, polished, athlete-friendly content those features usually produce. A little backstory, some thoughts on the season, maybe a quote about friendship and growth, and the power of believing in each other. A carefully crafted narrative that makes everyone involved look good. What actually happened was something entirely different. Hull used that platform to say things that most players in her situation never say publicly. She named the envy directly. She acknowledged that the media attention surrounding the Indiana Fever, the cameras, the sponsorship deals, the national broadcasts, the complete transformation of the franchise's profile had generated real resentment from other corners of the league. She said it clearly. There was jealousy over what the Fever had become because of Caitlin Clark's presence, and it wasn't just coming from fans or media commentators. It was coming from inside other locker rooms. Think about what that represents. It's a willingness to acknowledge the dark side of success. It's a refusal to pretend that everything is harmonious and positive within the league. It's an admission that winning and success breed resentment, and that resentment comes from within the professional basketball community, not just from outside observers. That's not something most players would say publicly, because it draws attention to the negative aspects of what's happening. And then she went further, and this is where it got real. She said the Fever had heard it firsthand. Not secondhand gossip or outside speculation. They had heard players and teams in opposing locker rooms explicitly saying they could not allow Indiana to win. That the target on the Fever's backs wasn't metaphorical. It was literal and deliberate, and it was being spoken out loud by the people competing against them night after night. Think about what that actually means on a practical level. Every single game the Indiana Fever plays is treated by opponents as if it has playoff consequences. Every individual matchup against Clark and her teammates carries an intensity that goes far beyond normal regular season competition. Referees are under a microscope every time Indiana takes the floor. Every call, every no call, every moment of contact gets filmed, analyzed, argued over, and used as ammunition by people who have probably never attended a professional basketball game in their lives. And every player on that Fever roster lives inside that environment every night of the season. Lexie Hull had been living in it for 2 years by the time she gave that interview to Glamour. She had watched it up close, in real time, from the inside of the most scrutinized team in women's sports. She had felt it in opponents' body language on the floor. She had heard it from the people playing directly against her. She had experienced the extra physicality, the harder fouls, the psychological intensity that comes when other teams decide they need to stop Indiana by any means necessary. And when she decided to talk about it, she didn't frame it as a complaint or a grievance or a plea for sympathy. She said, "Fine, use it. If the extra motivation other teams feel when they play Indiana makes them come in harder and more prepared, then good. Everyone deserves to face the best version of their opponents." The Fever believe they get that every night, and Hull's attitude toward it was essentially, bring it. Her response to being the target wasn't to resent the pressure or deflect from the reality of it. It was to treat it as a baseline condition of competing at the level she had chosen to compete at. That is not a small thing. That is a genuinely rare quality in professional athletes. Most players would complain. Most would feel aggrieved. Most would use the extra attention and resentment as an excuse for poor performance. Not Hull. For her, it was just part of what playing on the Indiana Fever meant in 2025. It was the most honest thing anyone connected to the Indiana Fever had said publicly about what it actually costs to be part of Caitlin Clark's world, and it landed because it came from someone who had earned the credibility to say it. Hull had proven herself on the court. She had shown that she was capable of playing elite basketball. She had demonstrated that she could handle the pressure and the scrutiny. So when she talked about what all of this felt like from the inside, people listened. She had earned the right to be heard. When you step back and look at the full arc of what Lexie Hull has been through, the picture that emerges is something worth sitting with for a moment. She entered the professional game as a genuinely gifted player on a franchise that was quietly falling apart. She came in with elite credentials, with evidence that she belonged at the highest level, with all the markers of future success. But she was entering an organization that couldn't provide the environment she needed to thrive. She spent 2 years fighting to hold a roster spot, averaging numbers that didn't reflect her actual ability, and surviving in a psychological environment that was slowly dismantling whatever confidence she had arrived with. She was scared. She was struggling. And almost nobody outside those walls knew how bad it had gotten. The world saw a young player who was struggling statistically. The world didn't see the fear. The world didn't see the psychological weight. The world didn't see a player questioning whether she belonged. Then the most disruptive force women's basketball had ever seen walked into the building and changed every single variable simultaneously. The team's culture shifted. The franchise's profile exploded. Hull's own game was freed from the mental prison it had been locked in. She shot 47% from 3. She became a legitimate two-way contributor on a team that went from lottery-bound to semi-final contention. She formed one of the most genuine, visible friendships in the league. She became a household name in WNBA circles, not through marketing or personal branding, but through the unmanufactured combination of real performance and real personality. And she did it while being completely honest about what all of it actually looked like from the inside, the fear in those early years, the freedom that came with having a playmaker of Clark's caliber beside her, the emotional weight of watching a close friend battle her own body through injury after injury, the reality of playing on a team that every opponent treats as a personal enemy. She talked about all of it. Not in the carefully managed way that PR teams design athlete interviews to be, but in the direct, clear, human way that actually resonates with people who are paying attention. That's what separates her story from the dozens of other peripheral narratives that orbit Caitlin Clark's career. This isn't a story about proximity to fame. It's a story about what someone does with that proximity, whether they shrink from it or grow into it, whether they disappear into the background noise or find their own voice inside the chaos. Lexie Hull found hers. And the fact that she found it in one of the loudest, most intense environments women's sports has ever produced makes it considerably more interesting than it would have been under any quieter circumstances. Now the question is, what comes next? Hull entered the 2025 offseason as a restricted free agent for the first time in her professional career. That is a different kind of uncertainty than anything she has faced before. In her early years, the question was whether she would make the team at all. Now the question is whether the team she has helped build into something genuinely real will find a way to keep her. The Fever have the right to match any offer she receives from another franchise, and given what she contributed in 2025, the expectation across the league is that Indiana will do whatever it takes to retain her. But professional sports are rarely as simple as what the logic of the situation suggests. The WNBA's collective bargaining landscape is complicated in ways that create uncertainty for everyone involved. And Hull herself admitted she couldn't fully predict how everything would shake out. What she could speak to clearly was what Indianapolis had come to mean to her. Her fiancé relocated his entire life there. She has built connections in that city that go well beyond a basketball contract. The Fever fan base, which had grown alongside the team's transformation over the past 2 seasons, had become something she openly expressed affection for. None of that guarantees anything. It rarely does in this business. What it does guarantee is that wherever Lexie Hull plays next, she carries something with her that cannot be contracted or negotiated away. She knows exactly who she is as a player, and as a person in a way she absolutely did not when she walked into that building as a scared 6th overall pick in 2022. She knows what she is capable of when the environment around her matches her talent. She knows how to be a genuine teammate rather than a performative one. She knows how to be honest about hard things in public without making it about herself. And she knows, maybe more clearly than most people who have been in her situation, what it actually feels like to go from the edge of being forgotten to the center of the most talked about story in women's basketball. That kind of knowledge is rare, and the way she has chosen to use it, generously, honestly, and without the protective veneer most athletes build around their most vulnerable truths, is what makes Lexie Hull worth paying attention to long after the Caitlin Clark story has moved on to its next chapter. Because this was never really about the shadow. It was about what she built in spite of it. And she is just getting started. The story of Lexie Hull isn't a footnote in Caitlin Clark's narrative. It's not a sidebar about what happens to players around transformative talents. It's a story about resilience, about psychological strength, about finding your voice in the loudest possible environment. It's about what happens when someone decides to be honest instead of protective, generous instead of resentful, present instead of bitter. Hull could have made different choices. She could have been resentful about Clark arriving. She could have been jealous of the attention. She could have leaned into complaints about the target on the team's back. She could have disappeared into her own struggle. Instead, she chose to support her friend, contribute at an elite level, and speak honestly about what all of it meant. That choice defines her. And that's why her story matters beyond basketball. It's about the kind of person you choose to be when circumstances are difficult. Hull chose well.